Hi everyone, my name is Belen Mella, and this is your Champion Briefs video topic analysis for September and October. Now, the debate community calls September and October Septober because it's the one time a year when the public forum debate topic lasts 2 months. That means it's a great opportunity for novices to get their feet wet and get exposure into what debate is like, and it's an amazing opportunity for veterans to get into some really interesting, really high-level conversations and debates about the topic. So with that in mind, let's get right into it. The resolution is resolved deployment of anti-missile systems is in South Korea's best interest. Now, this is an extremely interesting and extremely timely resolution, with news about South Korea and North Korea and specific missile systems coming out nearly every day. So my first recommendation for you is going to be to set up Google Alerts. Google Alerts are very handy. You type in a few buzzwords that you want to be updated about whenever they pop up in the news. For this topic in particular, you might want to have a variety of different types of evidence. So on the one hand, you're going to want news articles. You're going to want to know how South Korea's current regime feels about the anti-missile systems the United States is trying to put there, how China might be responding up to the minute, how North Korea's missile program is developing. But you might also want long-term political literature that might be decades old, in which they go into details about how arms races might lead to more conflict, or about how mutually assured destruction balances with missile defense systems. Things that have been analyzed for many, many years and that might supplement your up-to-the-minute news evidence in a very helpful way. The first big buzzword in the resolution is deployment of anti-missile systems. Now, there's a couple of ambiguities here. The first one being deployment where? We could reasonably assume that it's deployment in South Korea, since it is a resolution about South Korea's best interests, but if there's one thing you need to know about debate, is to never take anything for granted. Your opponents might have some crazy framework that involves deployment in the ocean or somewhere you don't even think possible, so be prepared against all interpretations. The second big thing, and big ambiguity, is deployment of whose anti-missile systems. South Korea might be developing an indigenous anti-missile defense program. There might be Japanese anti-missile defense programs, and there's certainly American anti-missile defense programs that are in the talks for defending South Korea. So once those ambiguities are dealt with in the round, and it's something that it isn't explicitly in your case, should at the very least be something you've dealt with your partner, so you know how to respond to it if it comes up. Once that's been addressed, you get into the question of what is an anti-missile defense system. So, in short, it's something that protects against missiles. The use of the word system suggests that it might be like a set of procedures, a set of processes for how to respond. It could also just be these specific machines that are invented to deal with this, and they can be sea-based, they can be land-based, they can be space-based. So, as soon as you Google this, the thing that's going to pop up time and time again is THAAD, and that stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. The reason that'll come up so much is because that's a US anti-missile defense system that's currently being placed in South Korea. Now, the history of this is a little bit tricky. So, THAAD was put in Guam at around 2013 because of threats from North Korea. So the United States has already put it forward in a similar type of situation. It's more complicated with South Korea because Guam is an American territory, of course. So, the way THAAD works is that it's designed to shoot down short and intermediate range missiles in the terminal phase, often described as shooting a bullet with a bullet. So as the missile's coming down, that's where THAAD works. There is debate out there in the literature about whether or not THAAD is effective. Like, some people think that it just downright isn't an effective tool. If you can substantiate that, without getting into overly technical discussions, but if there is evidence to cast doubt as to whether THAAD works, definitely use that in round and definitely be prepared to respond to that. So a little bit more about this history. In the summer of 2016, the South Korean Defense Ministry was originally deciding to deploy THAAD. Now, things got a little complicated because there was this multi-million-dollar corruption scandal with the president of South Korea at the time, Park Geun-hye. Now, in the last few days, few weeks of her being in office, they sort of sped through the THAAD deployment to make sure that the following administration wasn't going to be able to reverse it. This made a lot of people very angry. The following administration, President Park, was going to allow it to remain, but then he realized that people had been going around his back, so then they got more angry and they decided to halt it altogether until an environmental review had been conducted. Now, as of August 2017, this environmental review was conducted, they determined that it was safe, and they're moving forward with the deployment. But if you look at polls of South Korean public opinion at different points in time, you're going to see that there is debate, that some people are opposed to this sudden deployment, particularly people where THAAD is being deployed, because it makes them a target of aggression. So we're going to spend a lot more time talking about THAAD, and in your research, you are going to spend a lot of time talking about THAAD. But it is worth asking, is that what debates should be about? If the resolution, if the debaters, the framers of the resolution wanted you to debate THAAD, why wouldn't they have just said so explicitly? The reason this is complicated in framing rounds is that there's some benefits and harms, maybe particularly harms, that are very specific to THAAD that don't necessarily apply to anti-missile systems in general. For example, there's plenty of issues related to the politics of it being an American system on South Korean soil and how that might anger China, or how might that anger South Koreans, or how that might please the United States, that are all THAAD-specific problems that don't apply to anti-missile defense systems in general. So whether you and your opponents agree to debate THAAD can have a lot of implications for ground in the topic. Another thing to consider is uniqueness, right? Because THAAD, or even this so-called anti-missile system that's addressed in the resolution, would only be one piece of a broader anti-missile defense puzzle. And there are currently anti-missile defense systems that the US has in the Pacific, so it is a question of what the marginal increase in security or the marginal increase in whatever impact that you might be talking about would be from deploying something as it's described in the resolution. All things to consider. Okay. Next big phrase in the resolution is South Korea's best interests. This seems obvious, but it needs to be reiterated. It's a question from South Korea's perspective. The type of research that you're going to find when you get on Google is mostly going to talk about the United States perspective, because you're mostly going to be drawing on US sources. Don't forget that you're looking at South Korea's perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that other countries don't matter. Like, if something angers the US or angers China, it might have ripple effects on South Korea that could then in turn harm their best interests, but that's the end goal. That's the perspective you want to be looking for. So, best interests. It's implied there that there's plenty of interests that countries have and that they need to balance between these interests, right? So this debate is going to be about best interests, who points out what's the most important thing in a very delicate balance of magnitude and probability. This is debate speak for something like a nuclear war would be terrible. It would have tremendous magnitude as far as an impact is concerned, but it's less likely to happen than South Korean domestic opposition leading to protests, leading to some other effect. So how you balance these things and what you determine is a country's best interest is crucial to your framing of this round. So some interests you might want to take into consideration. Definitely security, right? Security interests, literally keeping people safe. Now that might be as far as missiles are concerned, like an anti-missile defense system's ability to literally shoot down a missile before it harms a city, or it might be as far as an arms race is concerned. Maybe deploying an anti-missile system leads to an acceleration of the arms race in Asia, which then in turn, because of some evidence you find, causes war to be more likely to happen, something like that, right? So security interests are paramount because they affect people's lives. You'll always hear debaters at the end of round saying, vote for us, lives are the most important issue. There's also political interests, of course. So I already touched on this briefly, but there's political interests as far as the relationship with the US, definitely with China, perhaps with Japan as well. There's also domestic political interests as far as domestic opposition or favorability toward anti-missile systems being deployed on South Korea. So politics matters. Now, when we talk about impacts, it's important for you to quote-unquote terminalize your impacts. What this means is that you don't just leave it as far as China will get angry, right? Because that in and of itself doesn't matter. No judge is going to be like, well, China can't be angry, that's inherently a bad thing, so I'm going to vote for this argument, right? A terminalized impact means that you actually get to the nitty-gritty of how it affects things on a daily basis, right? Like, who will actually be harmed, particularly from a South Korean perspective. So if China gets angry, that might not be an impact in and of itself, but if that in turn leads them to a boycott, which we'll discuss in a bit, of South Korean goods, which in turn is bad for the South Korean economy, which in turn specifically affects the South Korean people in a way that you could hopefully quantify, or at the very least give a detailed picture for the judge to vote on, that's a good impact. So we address security, we address political. Another biggie is economic. Again, sort of already touched on. Economic interests are paramount as well. A big thing you'll notice is that a lot of these things are intertwined, right? So if a country doesn't have a strong economy, it probably is going to have a harder time defending itself because sustaining a military is expensive. If countries have weakened economic ties, that'll probably be bad for their political ties because those things are extremely intertwined. So this stuff, in my experience as a debater, made it confusing to write cases because I was like, oh, my warrants lead to each other's impacts. But once you disentangle that mess, use it to your advantage. If your opponents are making a great point about security impacts and you're sort of iffy on that debate, go back and explain to the judge why your economic impacts and your political impacts are the better link into a security concern. The next big thing I think you guys should have before you get into your debates is a teeny bit of background as far as nuclear politics and the state of North Korea's nuclear program, because that's the elephant in the room when we discuss South Korean anti-missile defense systems. So, nuclear background. The phrase you might be familiar with is mutually assured destruction. That means that when two countries are both nuclear actors, they both have nuclear weapons, neither of them particularly want to use them because of what the phrase sounds like. It's mutually assured destruction. This ties into the idea of deterrence. Deterrence is when you keep someone else from attacking you because you have this big bad weapon at your disposal. So the idea goes that the world becomes a lot more safer when there's deterrence. Now, this is when I say that you should be looking into like literature and political science studies and things like that, and less so at more recent news articles, because this has been studied extensively, and there's a lot of theories about how anti-missile defense systems play into mutually assured destruction, whether deterrence works or doesn't work, how it plays into conventional warfare, if not nuclear warfare. Plenty of things to be considered here. The other big idea here is second strike capabilities. So second strike capabilities are a country's ability to respond to a nuclear attack with their own nuclear weapons. So the idea here is that if a country doesn't have enough nuclear weapons to still be able to nuclearly respond after an attack, then it doesn't have second strike capabilities, and then you don't have mutually assured destruction. That'll become relevant a little later on. So moving into North Korea's nuclear program. Plenty of details here. There's a distinction between hydrogen and atomic bombs. North Korea claims that they've mastered hydrogen, or at the very least working on it, which is more scary. Uranium versus plutonium bombs. Again, North Korea claims to have a uranium enrichment program. And then the big thing from America's perspective is that they're sort of improving their intercontinental ballistic missile program. That would be very bad from America's perspective because there's a difference between having a nuclear weapon and being able to miniaturize it and put it on a warhead and actually deliver it. But here I'm doing the thing that you shouldn't be, which is remember South Korea's perspective. What's interesting here is that from South Korea's perspective, North Korea has been able to attack them for a very, very long time, right? And if you look at interviews on the ground of South Korean people, there isn't this tone of imminent existential threat all the time. So while anti-missile defense systems are comforting and they're important and they do garner some popular support from a security perspective, think about these issues from the perspective of South Korea, for whom North Korea is a neighbor that has had nuclear capabilities for quite some time and the ability to deliver to them because they're right next door. The other big buzzword you'll hear when it comes to North Korea's nuclear program and nuclear weapons in general is this idea of rational leaders, right? So with the North Korean government, you see crazy propaganda, you hear crazy rhetoric, and that leads many journalists to assume this is an irrational person, they're going to use these nuclear weapons even if it would be an existential threat to them. Plenty of analysts to the contrary say no. Pursuing a nuclear weapons program has been the rational choice for North Korea because it'll give them leverage against international responses of any kind. So the question of rationality comes into play because it affects whether or not a nuclear weapon would actually ever be used. Now, there is certainly a case to be made that nobody wants to play with fire. Whether he's rational or not, let the analysts debate that question. There should be an anti-missile defense system on the off chance that something goes wrong. Okay, let's dig into some pro-arguments. So the first big obvious pro-argument leading into or tying into what I was just saying is security. If there were ever an attack, an anti-missile defense system would be able to protect from that attack. That's a big reason to vote for the pro. Pro teams are just going to have to substantiate this by talking about the likelihood of that ever happening, talking about the uniqueness of the deployment of an anti-missile defense system relative to what already exists, relative to the fact that conventional warfare might be just as likely or more likely, relative to a bunch of different details. Once that's settled, it's a question of impacts, where this argument certainly is going to garner tremendous impacts, just because a nuclear attack on South Korean soil would be devastating. So security, it's the low-hanging fruit, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a huge reason why an anti-missile defense system would be beneficial. Another big argument has to do with US-South Korea relations. Now, this one's a THAAD-specific argument, so take that as you will. The United States has been trying to put THAAD on South Korea for a long time. They had luck with the previous president, they had more of a political struggle with the current administration, so now it seems to be moving forward, but if it were to be halted, that might be bad for US-South Korea relations. Now, why might that matter to South Korea? The United States is a huge strategic partner to them. It's important as far as security is concerned, as far as the economy is concerned. And if South Korea stops being part of the United States' Asia strategy and this alliance is weakened, then that might be bad for both parties, but also bad from South Korea's perspective. Now again, terminalize these impacts. It's tough because these things are speculation. These things are sort of, if this happens and that might lead to something. So no, we don't know that like X million jobs or X war would break out and the United States would be there to protect them, but ground these things as much as you can because that'll give you a better chance of weighing it at the end of the round. Third thing, another element within the security conversation. So the idea here, and Jacob Berta expands on this in his topic analysis, is that if Americans can be assured that they'll not suffer nuclear retaliation, they're much more likely to come to the defense of South Korea. So the idea here is that if North Korea has a nuclear program, a deliverable nuclear weapon, and there's no competent anti-missile defense system to protect the rest of the world from their nukes, then the United States and everyone will be hesitant to engage with them militarily, right? Because there's the oft-repeated phrase, you don't mess with a nuclear actor. So by sort of neutralizing their threat, by having anti-missile defense systems that are competent, that are all over the place, that are close to North Korea, then you sort of take away that leverage and you make countries like the US more likely to rise to the occasion should there be a conventional altercation between North and South Korea. And then fourth, another interesting argument is that it might eventually lead to weakening North Korea. So the way that this works is that if there is this working anti-missile defense system in South Korea and North Korean weapons no longer pose as large of a threat, then North Korea is going to want to advance their program. They're going to want to build different types of missiles that won't interact with THAAD's radars or generally will be immune to the current anti-missile defense systems in place. Now, that can be turned to sound like a bad thing, right? Because an even more developed nuclear program doesn't sound great, but you could also argue that it'll weaken North Korea and strain their resources. Because if they keep on having to play catch up and improve their weapons program and make it better and stronger and more advanced, and they're constantly at the sort of lagging end of this catch-up game because the anti-missile defense systems are getting bigger and better, then their resources will be strained. They already spent an absurd amount of their GDP on their defense budget as it is. Should they have to spend even more to just catch up to these improving anti-missile defense systems, it might render them incapable of sustaining themselves as a government. Okay, let's talk about some con arguments. So, one big piece of background that you need to know about this is how THAAD's radars in particular might affect China. So, while the United States and Russia, for example, have a ginormous nuclear stockpile, China's approach has been to be more conservative, and they have enough for second strike capabilities, but they don't have this plentiful, crazy amount that the US and Russia have. So, THAAD, while it wouldn't work to actually intercept Chinese missiles specifically, does have radars that could collect information on Chinese warheads. Now, what that means is that if there were some sort of nuclear situation, then THAAD radars would be able to detect and differentiate between decoy fake warheads and real ones. That diminishes the credibility of China's nuclear deterrent, and it diminishes their second strike capabilities. So, long story short, China is not a fan of THAAD. They don't want it to be in place, and they've made that extremely, extremely clear in every possible outlet. Now, this only becomes a debatable argument once you tie it to how they might retaliate and how that might affect South Korean interests. So, some examples to consider. One, economic, and this one has the most proof in that it's already sort of taking place. So, China has already started to, quote, boycott South Korean products, stall sales at travel agencies, and shut down certain South Korean stores. Now, skeptics of this are going to point out that the biggest channels of trade between South Korea and China are still working, so these might just be sort of like symbolic gestures to let South Korea know that they're not down for THAAD. But if they are serious about an economic retaliation, then as South Korea's biggest trading partner, that would be a ginormous economic impact to consider. Second, and related to this, extremely related to this, is just the diplomatic political relationship between China and South Korea. They're not necessarily buddy-buddy on everything, but they are, it's important that they work together on certain key issues, and if that relationship is strained, although the South Korea certainly enjoys a political alliance with the United States, having a strained China relationship could affect them in a number of ways. And here debaters will benefit from looking into South Korea's concerns outside of the nuclear realm, just realistically just all of the concerns that they might have as a country of like conflicts they're involved in, of areas in which they want to grow, how China might play into them, because that will help you terminalize and tangibilize your impacts that relate to Chinese retaliation. And then the other concern here, as pertaining to China, is a security concern, right? Because similarly to how we said that North Korea might develop their nuclear program more if that proves to be effective, China might do the same. But while the argument with North Korea is that the resources would be exhausted and that they might become a little more crippled as a country, China has plenty of resources. So this could actually just lead to China to invest more money into the nuclear program, to improve their arms, to just generally spark or at the very least accelerate an Asian arms race. Again, tap into the literature of why an arms race is a bad thing, because more weapons sitting in warehouses isn't a strong impact. Weapons sitting in warehouses that could then be used to affect real people across the world, that's where your impacts are going to come from. So think about all of these things with this argument about China, why they're against that, and how they might retaliate. This is big con ground. Another con argument to consider is about the domestic opposition. So South Koreans are not gung-ho about that, and it's debatable how they might feel about other anti-missile defense systems. So the issue with that, as I explained in the background section, is a little complicated because it was sort of rushed by this former president that is extremely unpopular, was involved in this large corruption scandal. So right now it's a little tainted. It's a symbol of something that they sort of want to do away with. Whenever you look at polls, or whenever you cite polls, and especially whenever you hear them around, be skeptical. Look at when they took place, because public opinion changes every day, and look at how it's worded. Because I know I've found evidence that says that the majority of South Koreans oppose THAAD, but a key word there is the sudden deployment of THAAD. Maybe a staggered deployment would blend perfectly well with people. Think about how these polls are worded, think about how that interacts with the way the resolution is worded. By the same token, think about how that interacts with the phrase best interests, right? Because I might not want the US government to do something, but it might still be in our best interest as a country. People don't necessarily know their country's best interests, certainly not from an individual perspective. However, you could argue governments rule by consent of the people. If the people don't want it, it's certainly not something we should allow. Now, other than this political taintedness, some of the other arguments against THAAD from a domestic perspective is that it's bad from an environmental perspective, from a health perspective, and that in the specific area where it's being built, it endangers them, it makes them a target. So, look into these claims. I haven't been able to find the nitty-gritty details of the environmental concern, and there is evidence that they've done the environmental assessments and that it's fine, but there is an argument to be made for the actual substance of why South Koreans are opposed to it, and not just the fact that they're opposed to it. But, zooming out into this idea of South Korean opposition, again, it's not an argument until you show impacts. So, if South Korean opposition ripples into protests, which then affects food prices, or ripples into protests, which then decreases the government's political capital to get some bigger, more important project done, that's where you want to be making arguments. So these are just some of the ideas that you can you can get a start with as far as your research is concerned. Okay, so I hope this was helpful as far as giving you some argument ideas, giving you some background on nukes and North Korea's nuclear program and THAAD and whether or not that should be the focus of your debates. Now it's where you start. So get online, sign up for those Google alerts, start going on Google Scholar and figuring out what's the best literature on this topic that is going to give you those key analyses of how anti-missile defense systems works with making a country safer or less safe maybe, and start building arguments that are both not too swirly but also unique. So with that, I wish you the best of luck. September is an amazing set of months to practice your debate skills to get better. And as you go to more tournaments, you're going to hear more arguments, you're going to get inspired. Don't just write your case, write responses to opponents, and then write the responses to the responses they might make on your case. Think ahead of time, like a chess game, how the debate might evolve, and you'll be super prepared to do an amazing job. And above all, have an amazing time, have fun, make friends, make memories, and leave comments and download the Champion Briefs whole brief if you want more detailed arguments and cards and warrants to help substantiate and fill in your personal brief. Good luck.